3 days after I buried my husband Jamal, I dragged my exhausted body to my nephew's first birthday party. I stood in the corner of my parents' backyard, hiding my bloodshot eyes behind oversized dark sunglasses, trying to survive the afternoon. Without warning, my sister Chloe tapped a silver spoon against her champagne glass, silencing the music that had been playing over the patio speakers. She stepped right into the center of the crowd, looked at me with fake tears in her eyes, and announced to our entire family and church congregation that her 1-year-old son Lucas was Jamal's biological child. The crowd gasped as she pulled a folded notarized document from her designer bag. She claimed it was a revised will Jamal had secretly drafted before his sudden death, naming Lucas as his rightful heir and entitling Chloe to exactly half of the $800,000 custom home Jamal and I had built together. I stared at the fake will. Instead of collapsing in tears, I looked at her, nodded calmly, and said, "Oh, I see." What Chloe did not know was that I had to bite the inside of my cheek until it bled to stop myself from laughing hysterically, because my husband was medically incapable of fathering a child. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch your own family try to destroy your life out of pure jealousy and greed. My name is Maya. I am 34 years old, and until a sudden brain aneurysm took my husband from me, I thought I knew what heartbreak felt like. Jamal was a brilliant certified public accountant, a man who built his career with integrity, and loved me with a quiet, steady devotion that anchored my entire world. We had spent the last decade building a beautiful life in Atlanta. While he managed finances for top-tier clients, I poured my soul into building my own boutique public relations firm from the ground up. We were a team in every sense of the word. Losing him shattered my reality, leaving me struggling to breathe, let alone function. Yet only 3 days after we lowered him into the ground, my mother Yvonne insisted I attend this birthday cookout. She claimed it was about family unity, about showing the church elders that we were strong in the face of tragedy. In reality, it was about maintaining appearances, a skill my parents had perfected over decades. Growing up in our household, the lines were drawn early and permanently. I was the responsible one, the achiever, who was expected to handle my own problems silently. My younger sister Chloe, currently 30 years old, was the undisputed golden child. Whatever Chloe wanted, Chloe received. When she dropped out of college, my parents bought her a boutique clothing store that failed within a year. When she married Caleb, a 32-year-old white man who seemed perpetually allergic to steady employment, my parents welcomed him with open arms and open wallets. Caleb possessed a certain type of arrogant charm that my father Calvin found amusing, completely ignoring the fact that Caleb bounced from one failed business venture to the next, while Chloe lived entirely beyond their means. The afternoon heat was suffocating as I stood on the edge of the patio, sipping lukewarm water and wishing I was back in the sanctuary of the home Jamal and I had designed. The backyard was filled with aunts, uncles, and members of our congregation, all dressed in their Sunday best, eating barbecue and gossiping in hushed tones. I could feel their eyes on me, heavy with pity. I just wanted to survive the next hour and go home to my quiet, empty house. That was when Chloe made her move. The clinking of her glass cut through the murmurs of the crowd. I watched as she took center stage, adjusting her expensive dress, holding little Lucas on her hip. She thanked everyone for coming, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. Then she turned her gaze directly toward me. She took a deep breath and delivered the lie that was meant to ruin my life. She said she could not carry the burden of this secret any longer, especially now that Jamal was gone. She declared that during a rough patch in my marriage, Jamal had come to her for comfort, and that Lucas was the result of their affair. The silence that fell over the backyard was deafening. I could hear the wind rustling through the oak trees. Several women from the church choir gasped aloud. My mother Yvonne immediately rushed to Chloe's side, wrapping an arm around her, and Lucas casting a protective shield over the woman who had just confessed to sleeping with her grieving daughter's husband. My father Calvin stood nearby, his face a mask of solemn judgment directed entirely at me. Then Chloe reached into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out the weapon she thought would secure her future. She unfolded a piece of paper, waving it slightly so the notary stamp caught the afternoon sun. She announced that Jamal, racked with guilt, had secretly drafted a new will just weeks before his aneurysm. According to her, this document named Lucas as his biological heir and demanded that his estate be divided to provide for the child. Specifically, she stated that the will entitled her to exactly half the value of the $800,000 house Jamal and I had custom built just 2 years ago. Every eye in that backyard burned into my skin. They expected me to scream, to cry, to throw myself at my sister in a fit of betrayed rage. They expected the broken widow to shatter completely under the weight of this ultimate humiliation. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to defend my marriage, to defend the man who had treated her with nothing but respect. Instead, Yvonne shot me a cold, warning glare. She leaned across the small distance between us and spoke in a low voice meant only for me. "Do not make a scene, Maya. Jamal wanted a legacy, and your sister gave him one since you could not." Those words hit me harder than Chloe's announcement. Since you could not. For years, my family had weaponized our lack of children against me. They viewed my focus on my public relations firm as a selfish avoidance of motherhood, completely unaware of the private tears Jamal and I had shed behind closed doors. They thought my barrenness was a moral failing, a consequence of my ambition. And now my mother was using that very pain to justify my sister's miraculous, immaculate conception. I turned my attention back to the piece of paper in Chloe's hand. I looked at her smug, victorious face. She thought she had won. She thought her meticulously crafted lie was going to buy her a $400,000 payout to fund her and Caleb's lavish lifestyle. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I nodded my head slightly, looking right into her lying eyes, and said, "Oh, I see." I had to bite the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper. It was the only way to stop myself from bursting into hysterical, uncontrollable laughter right there on the patio. What my darling sister Chloe did not know, what my judgmental parents did not know, and what the whispering church elders did not know was a medical secret Jamal and I had sworn to keep private to protect his dignity. 5 years ago, long before little Lucas was even a thought, Jamal suffered a severe testicular complication that required emergency surgery. The procedure was life-saving, but devastating. It left him completely and irreversibly sterile. His medical team was explicit. There was absolutely zero biological possibility of him ever fathering a child naturally. We had mourned that reality together, holding each other in the hospital room, eventually finding peace in the life we were building, just the two of us. Jamal could no more be the father of Chloe's child than I could, but I did not expose her right there. As a public relations expert, I knew better than to blow a crisis wide open without controlling the narrative. If I called her a liar now, she would just pivot claim. The will was still valid regardless of biology, or drag the argument into the mud where she excelled. No, I needed to gather my ammunition. I needed to let her think she had successfully backed me into a corner. I lowered my head, playing the part of the utterly defeated, heartbroken widow. I let my voice crack just enough as I told the silent, staring crowd that I needed some air, that this was too much for me to process so soon after the funeral. I turned my back on the backyard full of traitors and walked through the side gate toward my car parked on the street. My hands were shaking as I unlocked my vehicle, but it was not from grief. It was from pure, concentrated adrenaline. As I opened the car door, I paused and glanced back through the wrought iron gate toward the front porch of my parents' house. There, standing half hidden in the shadows of the awning, was Caleb. He was not comforting his wife or tending to his supposed stepson. He was grinning from ear to ear, and standing right next to him was my father, Calvin. I watched, my blood turning to ice as Caleb raised his hand and my father met it in a firm, congratulatory high five. This was not just a sister making a desperate, crazy grab for cash. This was a coordinated strike. They had planned this together, waiting until I was at my most vulnerable, using Jamal's death as an opportunity to steal the life we had built. I slid into the driver's seat of my car and started the engine. I did not drive to a friend's house to cry. I drove straight back to the sanctuary of my custom-built home. I walked past the quiet living room straight into Jamal's home office and locked the door behind me. I moved the heavy oak bookshelf aside and opened the hidden wall safe we had installed during construction. I reached past our passports and emergency cash, pulling out the thick, airtight medical dossier from 5 years ago. I ran my fingers over the hospital logo on the front folder. They wanted to play games with my husband's legacy. They had no idea they just declared war on a woman who destroys reputations for a living. Let the games begin. My foot was pressing firmly on the brake pedal, my hands gripping the cold leather steering wheel of my car. I was ready to shift into drive and leave that incredibly toxic backyard behind forever. I just wanted to escape the staring eyes of my family and the suffocating heat of the afternoon. But before I could ease my foot off the brake, a frantic heavy tapping hit my driver's side window. I turned my head and saw my mother, Yvonne. She was panting slightly, her perfectly tailored Sunday church suit wrinkling at the waist as she leaned her body against my car door. I rolled down the window just an inch, foolishly expecting a shred of maternal comfort. I thought perhaps she had chased after me to apologize for the public circus my sister had just orchestrated. I should have known better. Yvonne gripped the glass edge of the window, her eyes darting around the driveway and the street to make sure none of her prayer circle friends or the church elders were watching our exchange. Her face was hard stripped of any maternal warmth, and her voice was a venomous, urgent whisper. "Do not make a scene, Maya," she hissed. "Jamal wanted a legacy. Chloe gave him one since you could not. We are going to keep this quiet and handle the house transfer with dignity." Those words felt like a physical blow to the chest, perfectly calibrated to strike my absolute deepest insecurity. For years, my family had weaponized my fertility struggles against me. While I was building a highly successful public relations firm and securing a rock-solid financial future for my household, Yvonne treated my empty womb as a personal failing. She viewed my career ambition as an affront to traditional family values. Chloe, meanwhile, was consistently praised and rewarded for her reckless behavior simply because she was fruitful. Chloe got pregnant by Caleb, a chronically unemployed white man who thought his superficial charm covered up his profound laziness, and my parents threw them a lavish baby shower. And now my own mother was standing in my driveway, weaponizing my dead husband's memory and my biological pain to justify my sister's blatant extortion. She actually wanted me to hand over $400,000 with dignity. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, the woman who clearly valued neighborhood gossip, church politics, and her golden child over her grieving daughter. I did not yell at her. I did not cry. I simply looked her dead in the eyes and rolled up the window, forcing her to snatch her manicured fingers back before they got caught in the ascending glass. I put the car in drive and pulled away, leaving her standing alone in a cloud of exhaust on the suburban street. The drive back to my neighborhood was a blur of adrenaline and ice-cold clarity. I did not head to a friend's house to seek comfort, and I did not pull over to weep. I drove straight to the custom-built 4-bedroom sanctuary Jamal and I had designed and paid for together. Pulling into the wide driveway, I looked at the dark brick exterior, the wraparound porch, and the modern landscaping. This house was a testament to our shared hard work, our late nights, and our unbreakable partnership. Chloe and her deadbeat husband Caleb wanted half of it, over my dead body. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the quiet foyer. The familiar scent of Jamal's cedarwood cologne still lingered faintly in the air, a phantom reminder of the good man I had just buried 3 days ago. Any other widow might have collapsed onto the pristine hardwood floor, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming weight of grief and betrayal. But the sheer audacity of my family's ambush burned away my tears. I bypassed the expansive living room, ignored the kitchen we had remodeled just last year, and marched directly down the hallway to Jamal's home office. The room was exactly as he had left it, his ergonomic leather desk chair, his dual monitors resting in sleep mode, his meticulously organized tax reference books lining the shelves. It was a space of logic, order, and absolute truth. I walked over to the massive oak bookshelf spanning the back wall. Using my shoulder, I pushed the heavy wooden structure aside. It slid smoothly on its hidden custom tracks, revealing a sleek steel wall safe flush against the drywall. I punched in the 6-digit code, the date of our wedding anniversary. The heavy door clicked open with a satisfying mechanical thud. Inside, past our passports, emergency cash reserves, and important insurance policies, lay a thick, airtight manila envelope. I pulled it out, closed the safe, and carried the heavy envelope to Jamal's mahogany desk. I broke the wax seal and spread the documents out across the smooth wood under the glow of the desk lamp. There it was, the official certified medical dossier from our reproductive specialist, the detailed surgical reports, the post-operative analyses, and the final physician sign-off. 5 years ago, due to a severe and sudden testicular complication, Jamal underwent an intensive, irreversible medical procedure. The documents explicitly stated he was 100% sterile. He was biologically incapable of producing viable sperm. We had kept this a fiercely guarded secret to protect his pride in a community that often equates a man's worth with his ability to produce children. We carried that secret together, finding peace in the beautiful, complete life we built, just the two of us. I ran my fingers over the raised, embossed seal of the hospital records. Chloe had stood in front of 50 people, including our parents and our church congregation, and claimed she had been sleeping with my husband. She had forged a legal document to steal half of my marital assets based on a completely fictional pregnancy. She thought she was so incredibly smart, playing the role of the tragic, conflicted mistress carrying the secret heir. She had no idea that I held the absolute, scientific proof that her son Lucas could never under any circumstances belong to Jamal. As the owner of a boutique crisis public relations firm, I deal with corporate scandals, malicious smear campaigns, and hostile extortion attempts on a regular basis. I know exactly how to build an impenetrable defense. More importantly, I know exactly how to launch a devastating scorched earth offense. Chloe and Caleb thought they were dealing with a vulnerable, emotionally shattered widow who would fold under the pressure of public humiliation. They did not realize they had just stepped into the ring with a professional strategist. I gathered the medical files and placed them neatly into my designer leather briefcase. I was already mentally drafting the timeline for my estate attorney, preparing to drop the heaviest legal hammer possible on their pathetic, greedy little scheme. I was going to let them dig their own graves, let them commit perjury, and then I was going to bury them with the truth. I sat back in Jamal's chair, taking a deep, fortifying breath, feeling the power dynamic shift firmly back into my hands. The element of surprise was entirely mine. I closed my eyes for just a second, allowing myself to feel a brief flash of triumph. But before I could even reach for a pen to write down my lawyer's emergency contact number, my cell phone vibrated aggressively against the hard wood of the desk. The sharp, persistent buzzing shattered the quiet sanctuary of the office. I glanced at the screen, expecting another toxic text message from my mother, demanding compliance, or perhaps a gloating note from my sister. Instead, the notification banner displayed the secure logo of my primary financial institution. It was a high-priority fraud and security alert. I quickly unlocked my phone and opened the banking application, my brow furrowing in confusion. A stark red banner flashed across the top of my digital dashboard. Access denied. I tapped the refresh icon, my heart rate instantly accelerating. The screen loaded again, displaying the exact same terrifying message. My primary joint checking account, the one that held our daily operating funds and mortgage payments, showed a balance of $0 available dollars. I quickly switched tabs to navigate to the high-yield savings account Jamal and I had been building for our future investments. Frozen. Access restricted pending legal review. A cold, terrifying realization washed over me, chilling me to the bone. Chloe and Caleb had not just put on a theatrical performance at a backyard birthday party to bully me into writing a check. They had actually hired a lawyer. They had taken that fraudulent forged will to a judge and filed an emergency probate injunction before they even made their public announcement at the cookout. They were not waiting for me to surrender. They were actively choking off my financial lifeline to paralyze me and force a quick, desperate settlement. The war had officially moved from my parents' front porch directly into my bank accounts. I stared at the flashing red security banner on my banking application for exactly 3 seconds before hitting the dial icon. My private wealth manager answered on the second ring, but his usual warm and accommodating greeting was entirely absent, replaced instead by a tight-clipped and deeply uncomfortable professional edge. He cleared his throat and informed me that a lawyer representing my sister had filed an emergency probate injunction just an hour ago. They had submitted a legal document claiming to be Jamal's final will and testament, effectively freezing my primary checking account, our joint savings, and the high-yield investment funds pending a formal judicial review. My blood ran completely cold, not from panic, but from the sheer calculated audacity of the strike. They knew the medical records I held in my safe would ultimately destroy their fake document, but they also knew the legal system moved at a glacial pace. By freezing my liquid assets immediately, they were trying to starve me out. They wanted to paralyze my ability to hire elite legal counsel and force a quick, desperate cash settlement. I demanded the name of the bottom-feeding attorney who filed the paperwork, but before my wealth manager could even read it off his screen, the heavy oak wood of my front door rattled under a series of violent, aggressive pounds. I dropped the phone onto the entryway console and pulled open the door. Standing on my porch was Caleb. The overpowering stench of his cheap drugstore cologne hit my senses before he even opened his mouth. He stood with his hands firmly planted on his hips, wearing a smug, wildly entitled grin that made my stomach physically turn. He did not bother offering a single word of condolence for the good man we had buried just 3 days ago. Instead, he shoved a meaty hand toward my face and demanded the spare set of keys to the house. He actually looked me in the eye and used the words "our half of the property." I looked at this man, a chronically unemployed grifter, who had leeched off my parents' deeply misguided generosity since the very day Chloe brought him home. For years, my mother and father had praised his so-called entrepreneurial spirit every time. Another one of his absurd startup ideas crashed and burned, while simultaneously criticizing my relentless 60-hour workweeks building an actual profitable public relations firm. They constantly handed Caleb cash to bail him out of debt, calling it a supportive family investment. Now he actually thought he could just muscle his way into the custom home Jamal and I had sacrificed everything to build. Caleb took a heavy, threatening step forward, trying to use his height and broad frame to shoulder his way past me into the foyer. He sneered, his face turning red with unearned confidence, telling me that my fancy PR money was not going to save me from the law this time. He loudly declared that Chloe and Lucas were the rightful blood heirs to Jamal's estate, and I was just a bitter squatter taking up space in his new investment property. He told me to step aside and let the real family take inventory of what belonged to them. I did not flinch. I did not back away or shrink myself to accommodate his aggression. I reached out with my left hand and tapped the sleek control panel of my home security system mounted on the foyer wall. A loud, sharp chime echoed across the porch, signaling that the high-definition cameras mounted above the door and along the eaves were actively streaming directly to a secure cloud server. With my right hand, I pulled my phone from my pocket and pointed the camera lens squarely at his flushed, arrogant face, ensuring the red recording dot was blinking steadily for him to see. I kept my voice dangerously calm, projecting the kind of absolute stillness that comes right before a devastating storm. I informed Caleb that until a federal judge signed a final order and placed it directly into my hands, he was trespassing on private property. I told him he had exactly 5 seconds to remove himself from my porch before I submitted this high-definition footage to the local police department for attempted burglary, trespassing, and harassment. I reminded him that given his rather colorful history of unpaid parking tickets and minor infractions, the police would likely love an excuse to pay him a visit. The bravado drained out of Caleb's posture in an instant. He knew I did not make empty threats, and he knew my security system was state-of-the-art. He took a stumbling, clumsy step backward down the brick stairs, his hands raised in a gesture of mock surrender. But his fragile ego simply could not handle a total silent retreat. He gathered a mouthful of saliva and spat violently onto my custom welcome mat, a disgusting display of his true character. He pointed a shaking finger at me and shouted that I had exactly 48 hours before the probate court forced the immediate sale of the house. He told me to have my bags packed and a moving truck ready, then turned, jogged to his beat-up sedan and sped off down my quiet suburban street, leaving dark tire marks on the asphalt. I closed the heavy front door, engaged the deadbolt, and wiped my phone screen, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. Before I could even open my photo gallery to review the security footage of his little tantrum, a high-priority email notification popped up at the top of my screen. It was from the chief operating officer of my public relations firm's absolute biggest corporate client. This was the flagship account that paid for my overhead, my staff payroll, and the core of my business operations. I opened the message expecting a routine approval on a press release, but the words on the screen felt like a second brutal physical blow to my chest. The tone was completely devoid of its usual warmth. The executive coldly informed me that they were immediately pausing our monthly retainer and halting all active campaigns effective today. The email explicitly cited disturbing family rumors and highly unethical behavior currently circulating online regarding my late husband's estate. My heart dropped into my stomach. Chloe and my mother had not just ambushed me at a cookout and attacked my personal bank accounts. They had orchestrated a full-scale digital smear campaign to systematically destroy my professional reputation and sink my business. The email from my biggest corporate client, pausing our contract, was just the first domino to fall in their coordinated attack. My phone vibrated again, this time buzzing with a relentless stream of notifications from the Mount Zion Fellowship group chat. I opened the application and watched my own mother orchestrate my public execution. Yvonne had uploaded a lengthy, highly produced video directly to the church's main social media page. In the video, she sat on her pristine velvet living room sofa, clutching a lace handkerchief with Chloe weeping softly beside her while bouncing baby Lucas on her knee. My mother stared directly into the camera lens and asked our entire congregation to pray for my hardened, bitter heart. She delivered a masterclass in emotional manipulation, telling 300 church members that my grief over losing Jamal had driven me to pure, unadulterated greed. She actually looked into the camera, lowered her voice to a theatrical whisper, and said, "It was a tragedy that the Lord never saw fit to bless my womb, but that my barrenness was absolutely no excuse to steal a fatherless toddler's rightful inheritance." She painted me as the angry, infertile villain holding a child's future hostage, while portraying Chloe as the brave, misunderstood single mother, just trying to honor a dead man's final wishes. The comments underneath the video were a bloodbath of church politics and toxic gossip. Women I had known since Sunday school were leaving prayer hands and typing out long paragraphs about how money is the root of all evil. A text flashed across my screen from one of the senior deacons advising me to stop embarrassing the family name and surrender the house deed for the sake of Black excellence and community unity. They were weaponizing my faith community against me. Yvonne and Chloe wanted me ostracized, isolated, and so deeply ashamed that I would simply hand over the keys to my house and $400,000 just to make the public humiliation stop. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a luxury I could no longer afford. My liquid assets were completely frozen. My flagship PR client had just halted my primary stream of business revenue, and my own blood relatives were trying to bury my reputation in the mud. I grabbed my designer briefcase containing Jamal's airtight medical dossier, marched out to my car, and drove straight to the downtown financial district. I bypassed the receptionist at the polished glass-walled office of Davenport and Associates. Mr. Davenport was a seasoned, razor-sharp estate attorney who had handled Jamal's actual legal affairs for years. He was a man who respected logic, order, and ironclad contracts. I walked right into his corner office overlooking the city skyline, pulled the heavy medical dossier from my bag, and slammed it down onto his immaculate mahogany desk, right next to a printed copy of Chloe's fraudulent will. I did not even sit down. I told Davenport to read the surgical reports and the final physician's sign-off from 5 years ago. I watched his eyes scan the medical documents detailing Jamal's complete and irreversible sterility. I watched the realization wash over his face as he picked up Chloe's fake will and compared the two realities. He leaned back in his leather chair, took off his reading glasses, and let out a long, heavy breath. He told me the fake will was an absolute joke. The legal phrasing was clumsy, the formatting was inconsistent with standard state estate laws, and the signature was a decent, but ultimately amateurish forgery. I demanded he call the judge right this second and have the probate injunction thrown out. I told him I needed my bank accounts unfrozen by the end of the business day because my public relations firm had a massive payroll processing on Friday. If I could not pay my staff, my business would literally collapse. Davenport shook his head, delivering a harsh, bitter dose of legal reality. He explained that fighting a probate injunction defensively is a bureaucratic nightmare. The county courts were severely backlogged. Even with the medical records proving the child could not possibly be Jamal's, lifting an emergency freeze on marital assets required scheduling a formal evidentiary hearing. He told me it would take at least 60 to 90 days just to get in front of a judge to present the medical files. For 3 months, my accounts would remain completely locked. I would not be able to pay my mortgage, cover my business overhead, or access the cash Jamal and I had saved. Chloe and Caleb knew exactly what they were doing. They were using the slow grinding machinery of the legal system to bleed me dry. They were betting that I would run out of money and fold before I ever got the chance to stand inside a courtroom and prove them wrong. I paced the length of Davenport's office, my mind racing through crisis management protocols. Playing defense was not an option. Waiting 90 days for a hearing meant losing everything I had built. I needed to shatter their injunction instantly, and the only way to bypass the probate backlog was to prove undeniable malicious criminal intent. I needed a felony charge to override the civil dispute. Davenport picked up the printed copy of Chloe's fake will again, holding it up to the natural light streaming through his windows. He squinted closely at the blue notary stamp pressed into the bottom corner of the page. He walked over to his filing cabinet, pulled out a thick ledger, and cross-referenced the name on the stamp. A slow, grim smile spread across Davenport's face. He tossed the fake will back onto the desk and pointed directly at the blue ink. He recognized the name on that notary stamp. It belonged to a disgraced former county clerk who had been quietly terminated 2 years ago for accepting bribes to alter property deeds. The man was a known hustler operating in the shady underground legal circles of the city. Chloe and Caleb had not just printed a fake document off the internet. They had actually paid a known criminal to stamp it and make it look official. Davenport told me that if we could prove Caleb paid this disgraced clerk to stamp the forged will, it would escalate the situation from a civil family dispute straight to a coordinated felony fraud conspiracy. An active criminal investigation would give Davenport the legal ammunition to walk into the judge's chambers tomorrow morning and demand the immediate release of my frozen assets. But Davenport was an estate lawyer, not a street detective. He told me the police would not prioritize a forgery investigation without hard, undeniable evidence handed to them on a silver platter. I realized right then that playing by the polite rules of the justice system was a guaranteed loss. I did not need a standard paralegal making polite phone calls. I needed a mercenary. I looked at Davenport and told him to give me the contact information for the most ruthless, relentless private investigator in his network. I needed someone who operated in the shadows, someone who could track Caleb's every movement and dig up the absolute dirtiest secrets hiding behind his arrogant smirk. Davenport gave me the name of a man named Silas. He was not a paralegal or a junior associate looking to climb the corporate ladder. Silas was a former fraud detective who had been quietly forced out of the department for being far too aggressive with his investigative tactics. For my current situation, he was exactly the kind of mercenary I needed. I left Davenport in his pristine corner office, rode the elevator down to the underground parking garage, and drove straight back to my house. I needed untraceable capital, and thanks to the brilliant, meticulous man I had married, I had plenty of it. When Jamal and I first built our home, he insisted on installing a heavy fireproof wall safe hidden behind the built-in bookshelves in his office. As a certified public accountant, Jamal knew exactly how ruthlessly the financial system could operate. He had grown up watching banks freeze the accounts of Black families over minor administrative errors, dragging them through months of bureaucratic red tape just to access their own paychecks. He promised me we would never be caught in a position where we could not buy our own freedom. We kept $50,000 in $100 bills, vacuum-sealed and neatly stacked, inside that safe. It was our ultimate emergency fund. Chloe and Caleb thought they had completely paralyzed me by locking down my bank accounts, but they had severely underestimated the man they were trying to steal from. I opened the safe, pulled out $20,000, and placed the thick stacks of cash directly into my designer handbag. I drove to a nondescript diner on the industrial edge of the city, a place where people did not ask questions. Silas was already sitting in a back booth nursing a black coffee. He looked exactly like a man who spent his life operating in the shadows, sharp eyes, neutral clothing, and a demeanor that gave absolutely nothing away. I slid a thick manila envelope across the sticky diner table. It contained $10,000 in cash, a printed photograph of Caleb, a printed photograph of Chloe, and the name of the disgraced former county clerk Davenport had identified from the fake notary stamp. I told Silas I was not interested in playing by polite societal rules. I wanted Caleb and Chloe shadowed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I wanted to know where they ate, where they slept, who they texted, and who they met in dark parking lots. I told Silas that my brother-in-law Caleb was an arrogant, chronically unemployed grifter who relied entirely on his superficial charm, and my parents' endless financial bailouts. Caleb believed he was the smartest person in every room, which meant he was bound to be sloppy. I hired Silas to find the mistakes Caleb was inevitably making and to locate the disgraced notary who had stamped the fraudulent will. Silas simply tapped the envelope, nodded once, and walked out of the diner. With my intelligence-gathering operation fully funded and deployed, I turned my attention to the absolute biggest threat to my survival: the public relations crisis. Chloe and my mother Yvonne were actively trying to burn my business to the ground with their pathetic theatrical social media videos. The email I had received earlier from my flagship corporate client pausing my contract was a fatal blow if I allowed it to stand. But I did not build a highly successful boutique crisis management firm by backing down when things got difficult. I built it by walking directly into the fire and controlling the flames. I drove straight to the glass and steel corporate headquarters of Apex Dynamics, my largest client. I did not call ahead to schedule an appointment, and I certainly did not wait for an invitation from human resources. I bypassed the reception desk with the kind of absolute unbothered confidence that makes security guards hesitate, and I marched directly into the executive boardroom. Julian Montgomery, the chief executive officer, was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany conference table surrounded by his risk management team. They were in the middle of a quarterly projection meeting. Every head turned to look at me in stunned silence as I pushed open the double glass doors and stepped into the room. Julian immediately stood up, looking deeply uncomfortable, adjusting his expensive tie. He stammered, telling me that human resources had already sent an email, that the optics of the disturbing family rumors circulating online were simply too risky for a major corporation to be associated with right now. I dropped my leather portfolio onto the center of the conference table with a sharp, echoing thud. I looked Julian dead in the eyes and commanded the room. I told him that he hired my public relations firm specifically because we handle massive, catastrophic crises for Fortune 500 companies. I asked him if he honestly believed that a suburban church gossip ring, led by my jealous mother and my grifter sister, was going to sink me. I leaned over the table, placing both hands flat on the polished wood. I told Julian that I was currently standing in the middle of a highly coordinated malicious extortion attempt by my own blood relatives, and instead of crumbling under the pressure, I was standing in his boardroom, taking complete control of the narrative. I flipped the script on them flawlessly. I pointed out the corporate reality of their decision. I told Julian that abandoning a highly successful grieving black female executive mere days after she buried her husband, all based on a baseless Facebook video, was an actual public relations nightmare waiting to happen. I asked him how the media would respond when I eventually proved the extortion attempt was a felony fraud conspiracy, and it came to light that Apex Dynamics panicked and dropped me at my most vulnerable moment. I offered them a masterful spin on overcoming personal adversity, pitching a narrative of absolute resilience. I told them that if I could navigate my own family trying to bury me, they should imagine the ruthless precision I would bring to destroying their corporate rivals. The room was dead silent. I could see the risk management team exchanging calculated glances. They knew I was right. Julian slowly sat back down, a look of profound respect washing over his face. He realized he was not dealing with a fragile victim. He was dealing with an apex predator. I reached into my portfolio, pulled out a newly drafted contract, and slid it across the table directly to Julian. I told him I was not just keeping the account. I was demanding a massive 6-month non-refundable retainer paid upfront to guarantee my firm's exclusive services for their upcoming product launch. I had spent the morning setting up a brand new limited liability company, legally distinct and entirely shielded from the probate courts handling Jamal's estate. I provided the routing number for this new untouchable corporate account. I told Julian that signing this contract was the smartest risk management decision he would make all year. Julian picked up his luxury fountain pen and signed the document without a single word of protest. I walked out of that corporate headquarters with my financial war chest fully secured and completely immune to Chloe's fraudulent probate freeze. I drove home that evening, feeling the power dynamic shifting violently back in my favor. The house was painfully quiet without Jamal, but I refused to let the silence break me. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, sat at the kitchen island, and watched the security camera feeds on my tablet. I was ready for a long, grueling legal war of attrition. But the timeline was about to accelerate much faster than I ever anticipated. It was close to midnight when my cell phone illuminated the dark kitchen. The caller identification showed an encrypted number. It was Silas. I answered the call immediately, asking him if he had managed to track down the disgraced notary who stamped Chloe's fake will. Silas's voice was rough, low, and completely devoid of emotion. He told me he found the notary, but that was the absolute least of my problems right now. He had spent the entire evening tailing Caleb through the darkest, most dangerous industrial sectors of the city. He told me Caleb was not spending his evening looking at real estate listings or planning a future for baby Lucas. Caleb was sweating, visibly shaking, and walking into back alley establishments known exclusively for illegal, high-stakes underground gambling. Silas paused, the heavy silence on the line, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He told me Caleb was not trying to extort $400,000 to upgrade his lifestyle. Caleb was desperately trying to buy his own life. The men Silas watched Caleb meet with were notorious loan sharks, violent individuals who did not utilize the court system to collect their debts. Caleb had dragged my sister, my mother, and my deceased husband's legacy into a desperate, ticking time bomb of a felony, because if he did not get his hands on my house money immediately, he was going to pay with his life. I pulled my car into the crumbling parking lot of a 24-hour diner located just past the industrial limits of the city. The buzzing neon sign overhead cast a harsh red glow across the wet pavement, perfectly matching the tension coiled tight in my chest. Silas was already waiting for me in the exact same back booth we had used before. He did not waste time with polite greetings or sympathetic pleasantries as I slid into the cracked vinyl seat across from him. He simply pushed a thick, heavy manila envelope across the sticky table. I opened the clasp and pulled out a stack of 8x10 glossy photographs. The images were grainy, clearly taken from a distance using a high-powered telephoto lens in low light. But the high resolution made every terrifying detail crystal clear. I stared at a sequential series of shots, capturing Caleb pinned violently against the brick wall of an alleyway. Silas informed me the location was the back exit of a notoriously brutal underground poker club operating out of a warehouse district. Two massive, heavily tattooed men had Caleb lifted almost entirely off his feet by the collar of his expensive custom-tailored jacket. The sheer terror radiating from Caleb's face was undeniable. He was sweating profusely, his mouth wide open in a desperate plea, and his hands were raised in absolute surrender. The men holding him did not look like debt collectors who relied on polite phone calls and sternly worded letters. They looked like men who broke bones and disappeared people. Silas kept his voice dangerously low, blending seamlessly into the ambient hum of the diner's outdated ventilation system. He told me he had tapped his old contacts in the Vice Division to get the full, unvarnished background on my brother-in-law. Caleb was not just a terrible businessman who occasionally asked my parents for a financial bailout to cover a failed startup. He was a degenerate high-stakes gambler who had aggressively crossed a very dangerous syndicate. Silas leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine, and gave me the exact number. Caleb owed the syndicate exactly $400,000 in gambling losses and rapidly compounding unpaid interest. The men in those photos had given him a hard, non-negotiable deadline to produce the cash or face catastrophic physical consequences. The disparate pieces of this insane puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. $400,000. It was the exact estimated value of half of the custom-built home Jamal and I had paid for. The amateurish fake will, the dramatic backyard confession at the cookout, the emergency injunction freezing my bank accounts. None of it actually had a single thing to do with Jamal's legacy or providing a future for little Lucas. Chloe had never slept with my husband. There was no secret affair born of marital strife. This entire elaborate, deeply malicious extortion scheme was a desperate, panicked cash grab to save Caleb from getting his legs broken or ending up at the bottom of a river. And Chloe was in on it completely. My beautiful, highly favored sister, who pranced around our church sanctuary every Sunday, boasting about her perfect marriage and her perfect white husband, was actually drowning in a nightmare of her own making. She was actively aiding and abetting a massive felony fraud just to maintain the pristine illusion of her flawless suburban life. She was willing to destroy my professional reputation, drag Jamal's impeccable name through the dirt, mere days after his funeral, and weaponize her own infant son, all to pay off the violent criminals her husband owed money to. The absolute audacity of it made my blood boil, surging hot and fast through my veins. For years, Yvonne and Calvin had placed Chloe on a pedestal, showering her with praise while viewing my grinding work ethic as a cold, unlovable trait. They had constantly handed Caleb cash to bail him out of his so-called business debts, calling it a supportive family investment. Now Chloe was literally trying to steal my home to cover up her husband's criminal gambling addiction. But the anger quickly gave way to a cold, calculating satisfaction. The photographs resting on the diner table handed me the ultimate leverage. I was no longer fighting a messy, emotional family dispute over a complicated inheritance. I was holding the detonator to a massive criminal conspiracy. I gathered the photographs, sliding them carefully back into the manila envelope. I thanked Silas, handed him another thick stack of $100 bills from my emergency stash to keep his surveillance operation active 24 hours a day, and walked back out into the cold night air. I got into my car and tossed the envelope onto the passenger seat. I finally had the motive. I had the means to crush them in a federal courtroom. I just needed to time my strike perfectly. I reached for my ignition button, but my phone suddenly lit up the dark cabin of my car. The screen displayed my father's name. Calvin never called me this late at night, unless it was a coordinated strategic attack. I answered the phone, forcing my breathing to remain completely steady and normal. Calvin did not ask how I was holding up. He did not ask if I had eaten or slept since burying the love of my life. He bypassed all basic human decency and went straight for the throat. He used his deep, authoritative baritone voice, the exact one he reserved for addressing the church deacons during highly contentious board meetings, and informed me that he had just gotten off a lengthy conference call with our pastor. He told me the leadership of Mount Zion Fellowship was deeply disturbed by the ongoing conflict that was currently threatening to tarnish our family's respected name in the community. Calvin declared that the pastor was convening a special closed-door intervention meeting in the church sanctuary this coming Sunday morning, a full hour before the main service began. He told me my attendance was absolutely not optional. The senior elders, my mother, Yvonne, Chloe, and Caleb, would all be waiting for me. My father then had the absolute nerve to tell me that I needed to bring the physical deed to my house and a pen. He said it was time for me to stop fighting God's will and surrender the property quietly to my sister for the sake of Black excellence and family unity. I sat frozen in my car, gripping the steering wheel, as I listened to my own father use the sacred concepts of community solidarity and racial uplift as weapons to strip a grieving widow of her hard-earned assets. He was literally trying to invoke church politics and religious guilt to bully me into funding Caleb's illegal gambling debts. Calvin smoothly lectured me, stating that a strong, successful Black woman like myself should understand the fundamental importance of lifting up the next generation, pointing specifically to Lucas, instead of hoarding wealth like a bitter, barren outcast. He warned me that the church elders were fully prepared to publicly denounce my greed from the pulpit during the Sunday sermon if I did not cooperate and sign the house over to my sister with dignity. I let him finish his righteous, deeply manipulative monologue without interrupting him once. I looked over at the manila envelope sitting quietly on my passenger seat, containing the visual, undeniable proof of Caleb's violent criminal ties and Chloe's desperate motivation. I did not scream at my father. I did not defend my moral character or beg for his paternal love like I would have done a decade ago. I simply told Calvin that I heard him loud and clear and that I would absolutely see everyone at the sanctuary on Sunday morning. I ended the call, started my engine, and pulled out of the dark diner parking lot. They wanted to use the holy sanctuary to stage an intervention and force my surrender. I was going to use it to set the stage for their public execution. Sunday morning arrived with the heavy, suffocating humidity typical of our city. I did not wear the standard subdued mourning attire expected of a grieving widow. I pulled a custom-tailored bone-white designer suit from my closet, pairing it with razor-sharp stilettos and a simple gold lapel pin. If my family wanted to use the sacred grounds of our church to stage a public execution and force my surrender, I was going to dress like the absolute boss of the boardroom. I gathered my designer briefcase, ensuring the medical dossier and the private investigator photographs were safely locked inside my vehicle trunk, and drove toward the battlefield. I pulled my car into the packed parking lot of Greater Hope Fellowship. This was the absolute epicenter of my parents' social and spiritual power. For 30 years, Calvin and Yvonne had meticulously cultivated their image as infallible pillars of the community. They sat on the senior elder boards, directed the annual charity drives, and dictated the social hierarchy of the congregation. As I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary, the ambient chatter of 300 congregants abruptly ceased. The silence that fell over the room was thick, immediate, and entirely intentional. Women in elaborate Sunday hats turned their heads to stare. The ushers stationed at the aisles paused mid-step. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor as I walked down the center aisle. Sitting in the very first row in the plush velvet seats explicitly reserved for the church leadership and their immediate families were my parents. Chloe sat tightly between them, holding baby Lucas on her lap, playing the picture of innocent wronged motherhood to absolute perfection. Caleb sat on the end of the pew, wearing a poorly fitted suit that could not hide the nervous, frantic energy radiating from his body. They did not leave a single empty space for me. I simply turned into the third row, taking a seat completely alone among a sea of whispering strangers, and crossed my legs. The choir finished their opening hymn, and the pastor stepped up to the grand wooden pulpit. He adjusted his microphone, opened his leather-bound Bible, and looked directly into my eyes. My father had clearly done his political maneuvering the night before. The entire sermon was a highly orchestrated, thinly veiled psychological attack. The pastor did not preach a message of grace or comfort for a widow who had just buried her husband a week ago. Instead, he paced across the altar, his voice booming through the massive speakers, preaching a fiery, targeted message about the devastating sin of greed. He shouted about selfish individuals who hoard financial blessings, refusing to uplift the next generation of the community. He actually pounded his fist on the heavy wooden pulpit and spoke at length about the tragedy of a barren spirit. He claimed that those who cannot bear fruit themselves must learn to humbly step aside and nurture the bloodline of their more blessed siblings. It was an absolute masterclass in religious manipulation. Every point he made, every scripture he twisted, was explicitly designed to paint me as a selfish, broken woman, actively defying divine order by withholding wealth from an innocent child. The congregation murmured in agreement, casting sharp, judgmental side-eyes in my direction. Caleb leaned back heavily in his front row pew, shooting a smug, victorious smirk over his shoulder at me. He genuinely thought this coordinated public shaming would break my resolve. He thought I would crumble under the collective judgment of my entire community and sign over a $400,000 house deed just to buy back my dignity and escape the stairs. I just sat there, my expression an unreadable mask of absolute calm. I let the pastor shout. I let the congregation judge, because I knew the truth resting safely in my car outside. As the brutal sermon concluded, the organist began playing a soft melodic hymn. It was time for the passing of the peace. a traditional moment where congregants walk the aisles to hug, shake hands, and offer blessings of fellowship to one another. Normally, I would be surrounded by older women asking about my public relations firm or offering sweet condolences for Jamal. Today, the space around my pew was treated like a designated quarantine zone. People actively stepped around my row, offering stiff, uncomfortable nods before rushing past to greet someone else. Then Yvonne stepped out of the front row. She smoothed down her immaculate designer skirt and walked slowly toward me, painting a perfect, highly visible picture of a merciful mother extending grace to her wayward, stubborn daughter. She leaned in close, wrapping her arms around my shoulders in a fake, rigid embrace. Her heavy, floral church perfume was suffocating. She pressed her lips right next to my ear so no one else in the sanctuary could hear the pure venom in her voice. "Stop fighting God's will!" "Maya," she whispered sharply, her fingernails digging painfully into my shoulder blade. "You are embarrassing this family and staining your husband's memory. Give your sister the money today, and this all goes away quietly." I pulled back just enough to look her directly in the face. My mother was standing in a multi-million-dollar sanctuary, wearing expensive jewelry, playing the role of a humble, pious martyr, suffering under the weight of an ungrateful child. I looked at her and remembered the cold, hard reality she actively hid from everyone in this room. 3 years ago, when Calvin made a terrible, reckless financial misstep and the bank threatened to foreclose on their pristine suburban home, it was not the golden child Chloe who saved them. I was the one who quietly transferred $150,000 of my own business profits to pay off their mortgage in full. I saved their pristine credit and their precious social standing, asking for absolutely nothing in return. Yvonne had buried that fact so deeply, she probably convinced herself it never happened, all to maintain her twisted narrative that I was a cold, selfish career woman who cared only about myself. I did not bring up the mortgage. I did not remind her of the debt she owed me. I simply smiled a bright, chilling smile, patted her arm gently, and told her I would see her outside. The final benediction was given, and the heavy sanctuary doors swung open. I walked out into the sunlit church lobby, eager to leave the highly toxic atmosphere behind and set my trap in motion. But the orchestrated ambush was not over yet. The lobby was packed with families socializing, drinking coffee, and discussing the sermon. As I reached for the main glass exit doors, a man stepped directly into my path, physically blocking my way out. I was wearing a cheap, wrinkled suit and carried a battered leather briefcase. He did not look like he belonged to our congregation. He looked exactly like the kind of bottom-feeding, sleazy attorney a desperate man like Caleb would hire out of a late-night television commercial. "Are you Maya?" he asked loudly, intentionally, ensuring his booming voice carried across the crowded lobby. Before I could even confirm my identity, he shoved a thick manila folder directly against my chest, forcing me to grab it or let it fall. "You have been served," he announced, his voice dripping with sleazy, performative satisfaction. The lively chatter in the lobby instantly died down. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, watching the drama unfold. Chloe, Caleb, Yvonne, and Calvin stood together by the sanctuary doors, watching the spectacle with absolute triumph radiating from their faces. I slowly opened the heavy folder and read the bold, capitalized legal text stamped across the top page. It was an emergency court order. My heart slammed violently against my ribs as I read the specific demands of the document. Chloe's lawyer had filed a formal subpoena demanding the immediate exhumation of Jamal's body. They were legally petitioning the county to dig up my husband, a good, honorable man, who had barely been resting in the earth for a week, to extract bone marrow for a mandatory paternity DNA test. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the document took my breath away, leaving me momentarily paralyzed in the center of the lobby. They knew the DNA test would prove absolutely nothing because the affair never happened. The medical truth did not matter to them. The subpoena was a weapon of pure psychological terror. They wanted to force me to vividly imagine heavy machinery tearing open my husband's fresh grave. They wanted to inflict such profound, unspeakable emotional trauma that I would finally break down, surrender the house deed, and pay them the $400,000 just to let Jamal rest in peace. I looked up from the sickening legal document. Caleb was staring at me from across the quiet lobby, his eyes silently daring me to fight back. He was a desperate man, backed into a corner by violent loan sharks, and he was willing to desecrate a sacred grave to save his own kneecaps. He thought he had just delivered the killing blow. He had no idea he had just handed me the match to burn his entire life to the ground. I stood in the center of the church lobby, with the heavy legal folder resting in my hands. The sleazy attorney who had just shoved the subpoena against my chest took a step back, crossing his arms with a theatrical, arrogant smirk. He was waiting for the meltdown. He was waiting for the grieving black widow to lose her composure, to scream about the desecration of her husband's grave, right there on the polished marble floors of the sanctuary. Across the crowded room, my parents, Yvonne and Calvin, watched me with eager, self-righteous anticipation. Chloe adjusted baby Lucas on her hip, whispering something to Caleb that made him chuckle. I looked down at the subpoena, demanding the immediate exhumation of Jamal's body for a DNA test. It was a vile, heartless piece of paper. But beneath my initial wave of nausea, my analytical mind instantly took over. I know crisis management. I know the legal system, and I know exactly how long the bureaucratic machinery takes to grind into motion. Exhuming a body is not like ordering a simple blood test. It requires an ironclad judicial order, extensive administrative hearings, health department permits, and months of mind-numbing red tape. Caleb did not have months. Silas, my private investigator, had provided me with undeniable photographic proof that Caleb was already being physically assaulted by dangerous men over a $400,000 gambling debt. Those loan sharks operated on deadlines measured in hours, not months. The subpoena in my hand was a complete bluff. It was a weapon of pure psychological terror designed to traumatize me into a panicked, immediate cash settlement out of court. They wanted me to fold simply to protect Jamal's physical resting place. I did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I smoothly folded the subpoena, slid it into my designer briefcase, and snapped the gold clasp shut. I looked across the lobby directly into Caleb's eyes. I did not look at my parents or my sister. I locked my gaze solely on the desperate, indebted grifter who had orchestrated this nightmare. I gave him a slow, chilling smile. I let him see that I was not terrified. I let him see that I knew exactly what he was hiding. The arrogant chuckle died in his throat. His posture stiffened and a flash of genuine uncertainty crossed his pale face. I turned my back on all of them, pushed open the heavy glass exit doors, and walked out into the bright Sunday sunlight. I drove straight to my public relations firm in the heart of the downtown business district. The glass and steel building was completely empty on a Sunday afternoon, providing the perfect silent fortress for my counterstrike. I rode the private elevator up to my executive suite, locked the heavy doors behind me, and sat down at my desk. Caleb wanted to play psychological warfare. He wanted to use intimidation and public pressure to force my hand. I was about to show him how an apex predator controls the narrative. I opened my encrypted laptop and logged into a secure, untraceable virtual private network. As a seasoned public relations strategist, I know exactly how information travels through the digital veins of this city. I did not need to make a public statement defending my marriage. I needed to apply maximum suffocating pressure directly onto Caleb's most vulnerable pressure point. I drafted a highly specific, viciously targeted blind item. I sent it directly to a ruthless underground local blog that specialized in exposing the dirty secrets of Atlanta's high society and the shadowy movements of its organized crime syndicates. The post was a masterpiece of strategic leaking. I wrote about a pathetic suburban grifter hiding behind his golden child wife and her prominent church-going parents. I detailed a fake baby daddy scheme engineered solely to steal a recently widowed woman's real estate assets. Most importantly, I explicitly mentioned that the grifter was using this fraudulent probate delay to dodge a massive six-figure debt owed to the wrong kind of people operating out of the warehouse district. I included just enough distinct, verifiable details to make the subject absolutely undeniable to anyone operating within that specific criminal circle. I mentioned the frozen assets and the ticking clock. Then, using a temporary burner proxy, I forwarded the published link directly to a specific untraceable phone number that Silas had identified as belonging to one of the primary enforcers who had pinned Caleb against the brick wall in those photographs. I hit send, closed my laptop, and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. The digital bomb was officially dropped. The loan sharks now knew that their $400,000 was entirely tied up in a messy, highly public fraudulent legal dispute that was practically begging for police intervention. Violent criminals despise public scrutiny. They despise messy family drama that attracts the attention of the courts. I knew they would not wait for a probate judge to rule on an exhumation. They would squeeze Caleb immediately. The pressure cooked faster than I even anticipated. It only took 48 hours for the entire facade to crack. Tuesday evening, I was wrapping up a highly productive day at the office. My new crisis management contract with Apex Dynamics was already yielding massive results, and my secure corporate accounts were flush with untouchable cash. I packed up my briefcase, turned off the office lights, and took the private elevator down to the executive parking garage beneath the building. The underground garage was dimly lit and eerily quiet, the sound of my stilettos echoing sharply against the concrete pillars. I was walking toward my luxury sport utility vehicle when the sudden violent screeching of tires shattered the silence. A beat-up sedan came tearing around the corner, blowing past a stop sign and slammed on its brakes, diagonally blocking my path to my vehicle. My hand instantly went to the heavy canister of pepper spray attached to my keychain, my thumb resting firmly on the safety release. But as the driver's side door flew open, I recognized the frantic, disheveled figure stumbling out of the car. It was Caleb. He looked absolutely unhinged. The smug, entitled confidence he had displayed on my front porch and in the church lobby was completely gone. His expensive Sunday suit had been replaced by a wrinkled, sweat-stained t-shirt and dirty jeans. His hands were shaking violently as he gripped the doorframe of his car to steady himself. But it was his face that told the real story. He had a fresh, dark purple bruise blooming aggressively along his jawline, and his lower lip was split and swollen. The loan sharks had cleared and decided to accelerate their collection methods. Caleb rushed toward me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, reeking of stale alcohol and pure, undiluted panic. I maintained my distance, keeping the pepper spray leveled discreetly by my side, projecting a wall of total indifference. He did not try to intimidate me this time. He did not threaten me with the power of his fake will or the backing of my parents. He lunged forward and slammed his open palms against the hood of my car, effectively trapping me between his body and the concrete pillar. He started begging, his voice cracking and frantic, echoing loudly in the empty garage. He told me the legal process was moving too slowly. He said the courts were dragging their feet and the lawyers were complicating everything. He was sweating profusely, scanning the dark corners of the parking garage as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows and grab him. He looked back at me, his chest heaving, and demanded that we skip the probate court entirely. He completely abandoned the narrative of providing a legacy for Jamal's supposed son. He told me he would make the entire paternity claim go away right now. He promised to rip up the will, drop the exhumation subpoena, and disappear from my life forever if I just bypassed the legal freeze and transferred $200,000 in cash to an offshore account by midnight. I stood there in the quiet, echoing parking garage, staring at the pathetic broken man sweating on the hood of my car. He was literally bargaining against his own fraudulent legal claim, dropping his price by half just to buy his life back from the men breathing down his neck. The trap I set was working perfectly. The psychological warfare had broken him in exactly 2 days. I watched the frantic, panicked breaths ripping through Caleb's chest as he remained pinned against the hood of my luxury SUV in the dark parking garage. I was begging for a quick $200,000 in cash to save his own life, completely abandoning the righteous narrative of securing a legacy for my supposed nephew. I did not flinch. I let him sweat against the cold glass of my windshield for a few more agonizing seconds, letting the silence stretch until he looked like he was about to physically collapse. Then I slowly lowered my driver's side window just a single inch. I let my shoulders slump forward, stripping the dominant posture from my spine. I forced my voice to tremble, perfectly executing the role of a shattered, utterly exhausted widow pushed to the absolute breaking point. I looked at him with wide, defeated eyes and told him that the church whispers were destroying my mental health. I told him that seeing the exhumation subpoena made me physically sick, and I simply could not fight this relentless battle anymore. I told him I would give them the $200,000 in cash to make the public humiliation stop. Caleb's eyes lit up with a desperate, greedy relief that was truly sickening to witness. He practically sagged against the car door, thanking me, promising that the forged will and the DNA demands would vanish overnight. But I set a firm, non-negotiable condition. I told him I was not doing a back alley cash drop in a dark corporate parking garage like a criminal. I told him we were going to do this the traditional, respectful way. I instructed him to gather Chloe, Yvonne, and Calvin at my parents' house tomorrow afternoon for a formal mediation cookout. We would sit down at the family dining table, sign a legally binding settlement agreement, and I would initiate the wire transfer directly in front of them. Caleb nodded frantically, swearing on his life that everyone would be there before he sprinted back to his beat-up sedan and sped out of the garage. I rolled the window back up, put the car in drive, and instantly dropped the exhausted widow routine. My posture straightened, and a cold, calculating smile spread across my face. I immediately called Mr. Davenport. I told the seasoned estate attorney that the psychological pressure had broken Caleb exactly as planned. Davenport was silent for a moment, clearly impressed by the ruthless efficiency of the trap. I instructed him to draft a highly specific, legally binding settlement agreement for the cookout. The document needed to require all parties, especially Chloe and Caleb, to explicitly state their claims to Jamal's estate on the physical record before signing. Next, I called Silas. I told the private investigator to maintain his aggressive surveillance on Caleb's loan sharks. I needed to ensure the syndicate stayed menacingly close to Caleb, keeping his panic at a boiling point. But I instructed Silas to make sure they did not physically intercept him before my mediation cookout. I needed Caleb desperate, not dead. The next morning, I prepared my wardrobe with the exact same ruthless precision I use for high-stakes corporate boardroom negotiations. I selected a tailored, deep emerald green blouse and sharp black trousers, projecting wealth and absolute control. But my most important accessory for the afternoon was completely invisible to the naked eye. I had purchased a discreet high-definition audio recording device. In my state, one-party consent laws dictate that I can legally record any conversation I am a part of without notifying or getting permission from the other participants. I taped the tiny, highly sensitive microphone flat against my collarbone, hiding it perfectly beneath the silk fabric of my blouse, and secured the compact recording pack against my ribs. As I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, testing the audio levels on the hidden device, a bitter memory washed over me. I remembered the very last time my family had gathered for a formal mediation cookout. I was 22 years old, fresh out of college, and I had foolishly begged my parents to co-sign a modest low-interest business loan so I could launch my public relations firm. Yvonne and Calvin had intentionally invited our entire extended family over just to publicly deny my request. They sat at the head of their grand dining table laughing at my ambitions, telling me that running a business was not a realistic path for a Black woman without corporate backing. They humiliated me in front of my aunts and uncles, and that exact same afternoon, they proudly handed Caleb a massive cashier's check to fund a ridiculous landscaping business that went bankrupt in less than 6 months. They had used their dining table as a stage to humiliate me and crush my spirit then. I was going to use that exact same table as an execution block today. I drove across town, pulling my car onto the pristine manicured driveway of my parents' sprawling suburban home. The heavy, sweet scent of smoked brisket, macaroni and cheese, and hickory wood wafted through the humid afternoon air. It was the classic, deeply comforting smell of a traditional Sunday family cookout, a scent that is culturally supposed to represent unconditional love, legacy, and community solidarity. But as I walked up the brick front steps and pushed open the heavy oak door, that warm, inviting aroma violently clashed with the absolute concentrated toxicity waiting for me inside. I walked through the foyer and stepped straight into the formal dining room. Chloe, Caleb, Yvonne, and Calvin were already seated around the long mahogany table. They were not talking or eating. They were sitting in total silence, smiling with predatory anticipation, their hands resting near their expensive pens. They looked like a pack of starving vultures eagerly waiting for me to pull out my checkbook so they could finally carve up the absolute last pieces of my life. The heavy, sweet scent of smoked brisket, baked macaroni and cheese, and hickory wood hung thick in the air, creating a nauseating contrast to the sheer, concentrated hostility waiting for me inside the dining room. They sat shoulder to shoulder along one side of the long mahogany table, a unified front of absolute, unadulterated greed. Yvonne had set out her best floral china, laying out a sprawling Sunday feast, as if this were a routine family gathering and not a highly coordinated shakedown. Calvin sat at the head of the table, his worn leather Bible resting right next to his glass of iced tea, fully prepared to weaponize his faith to justify stripping me of my assets. Chloe held court on his right, wearing a pristine cashmere sweater that she undoubtedly charged to a maxed-out credit card. Caleb sat beside her, bouncing his knee with an erratic, frantic energy that screamed of a man rapidly running out of time. I took the single empty chair positioned directly opposite them. I did not accept the plate of food Yvonne pushed toward me. I reached into my designer leather briefcase and pulled out the crisp, newly printed settlement agreement Mr. Davenport had drafted specifically for this ambush. I slid the document across the smooth, polished wood. It came to a stop right in the center of the table. I kept my posture slightly slumped, my shoulders drawn inward, and my voice soft. I played the role of a woman, thoroughly broken by the weight of public humiliation and relentless legal pressure. I told them the vicious church rumors were actively destroying my public relations firm. I told them the thought of the exhumation subpoena made me physically sick, and I could not endure another day of this nightmare. I offered them $200,000, payable via direct wire transfer, the very moment the probate freeze was lifted on the explicit condition that they permanently drop all claims to Jamal's estate and sign a sweeping non-disclosure agreement. Caleb scoffed loudly, the harsh sound echoing off the dining room walls. He slammed his hand flat on the table, rattling Yvonne's fine china, and declared that $200,000 was an absolute insult. Chloe picked up the contract, glanced at the numbers with a look of pure disgust, and tossed it back onto the table with a theatrical roll of her eyes. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany, and told me that Jamal explicitly promised her the full $400,000 to secure a proper affluent future for little Lucas. She claimed Jamal wanted his biological son to have exactly half the value of the custom home we built, asserting it was his dying wish to make things right. Yvonne immediately chimed in, perfectly executing her role as the self-righteous matriarch. She reminded me that as the older sister, it was my spiritual and moral duty to provide for the continuation of the bloodline, especially since my own womb had failed to produce a rightful heir. She sat comfortably in a house where I had secretly paid off the mortgage just 3 years ago to save them from foreclosure, and she looked me dead in the eye, demanding I finance her golden child's fake lifestyle. Calvin nodded in solemn agreement, tapping his Bible, urging me to stop fighting divine order and surrender the wealth gracefully. I swallowed hard, acting as though her cruel, targeted words had successfully pierced my armor. I looked directly at Chloe, letting a single carefully orchestrated tear brim in my eye. I asked her for the truth. I begged her for closure. I told her that if I was going to hand over the money I had built with my husband, I needed to know exactly when he had betrayed me. I asked for dates, for locations, for the precise timeline of their supposed affair. I pleaded with her to help me understand how I missed the signs. Chloe could not resist the opportunity to twist the knife. Her towering ego thrived on being the center of attention, on proving she was the more desired, superior woman. She smiled a sickeningly sweet, victorious smile and spun a detailed, elaborate fantasy right there at the dinner table. She claimed they began meeting at the downtown Ritz-Carlton. She confidently stated the affair began during the first week of October, exactly 2 years ago. She described in vivid detail how Jamal had booked the penthouse suite, how he had poured her expensive champagne, and how he had confessed that he was suffocating in our marriage because of my relentless obsession with my career. The highly sensitive microphone taped securely to my collarbone, hidden beneath the silk fabric of my blouse, captured every single syllable of her perjury. I knew for an absolute verifiable fact that during the first week of October 2 years ago, Jamal was 3,000 miles away in London. He was delivering a keynote address at an international accounting summit. His passport stamps, his flight records, his hotel receipts, and his corporate expense reports were currently locked inside the fireproof safe in my home office. Chloe had just arrogant walked directly into a trap, locking herself into a fabricated timeline that I could obliterate with a single piece of paper. I nodded slowly, burying my face in my hands, pretending to absorb the devastating blow of her elaborate lies. I acted hesitant, picking up my pen, letting my hand tremble just enough for Caleb to notice. I told them I was terrified the probate judge would reject this private settlement and keep my business accounts frozen indefinitely. I said I needed absolute assurance that their legal claim was solid enough to force the court's hand quickly, because if the judge delayed the unfreezing of my assets, I would not be able to wire them the cash. The sheer desperation in Caleb took over completely. His loan sharks were breathing down his neck, threatening his physical safety, and he could literally smell the money sitting right in front of him. He lost all remaining patience, shoving his dining chair back violently and leaning aggressively across the table. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, his cheap cologne overpowering the smell of the barbecue. He told me to stop stalling, stop crying, and just sign the damn paper. He bragged that their case was entirely bulletproof and that I had no way out. Then, driven by pure, unadulterated arrogance and a frantic need to assert his dominance over the situation, he delivered the absolute killing blow. He sneered, his voice ringing loud, clear, and perfectly captured by the hidden recording device resting against my chest. He said I did not need to worry about the judge rejecting anything because the revised will was an undeniable masterpiece. He explicitly stated, "Do not make this harder than it is, Maya. The will is ironclad. My guy made sure the notary stamp looks perfect." The echo of Caleb's words hung in the suffocating barbecue-scented air of my parents' dining room. My guy made sure the notary stamp looks perfect. He had actually said it out loud. Driven by pure, unadulterated arrogance and a frantic, sweaty desperation to secure the cash that would save him from his violent loan sharks, Caleb had just handed me a recorded verbal confession to a coordinated felony. He thought he was intimidating me. He thought leaning across the polished mahogany table and threatening me was the ultimate power move. He was completely unaware that he had just wrapped the legal noose tightly around his own neck and handed me the rope. I knew I had to react perfectly. Narcissists feed on the visible destruction of their targets, and I needed to give this entire table of vultures exactly what they wanted to see. I let my shoulders collapse forward, stripping every ounce of defensive posture from my spine. I sucked in a sharp, ragged breath and buried my face in my hands. I let the tears fall hot and fast, executing an Academy Award-winning performance of a woman who had finally been crushed under the relentless weight of public humiliation and legal harassment. I sobbed loudly, ensuring the hidden microphone taped to my collarbone picked up the raw, defeated sound of my fake surrender. I looked up at them with red, watery eyes and told them they had won. I told them I could not endure another day of the church congregation whispering about me, or the terrifying threat of having Jamal exhumed. I said I was completely broken. Caleb let out a massive, heavy breath of relief. The frantic bouncing of his knee finally stopped. He slumped back into his dining chair, running a shaking hand over his face. He thought his kneecaps were officially saved. Chloe smiled a sickeningly sweet, victorious smile. She adjusted baby Lucas on her lap, sitting up straight like a newly crowned queen who had just successfully conquered her older sister's territory. She slid the faux settlement contract across the table toward me, tapping the signature line with her perfectly manicured fingernail. I picked up the heavy brass pen my father Calvin always kept on the table for his church board meetings. I forced my hand to shake violently by design as I scribbled my signature across the bottom line of the document. I pushed the signed paper back toward the center of the table. Chloe snatched it up instantly, her eyes scanning my signature as if it were a winning lottery ticket. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, sniffled, and looked directly at Caleb. I told him we had a severe logistical hurdle to overcome before he could see a single dime of that $200,000. His victorious smile vanished, instantly replaced by a flash of sheer panic. I reminded him that his sleazy bottom-feeding lawyer had filed an emergency probate injunction that actively froze every single one of my personal and business bank accounts. I told them that in order to secure this massive amount of liquid cash within 24 hours, I had to leverage my public relations firm's corporate crisis management escrow account. I spun a masterful, legally dense lie. I explained that because the probate court had slapped a hard freeze on my marital assets, my corporate wealth manager was legally terrified of being held in contempt of court. I told Caleb that the bank absolutely refused to wire him the settlement money unless a presiding judge signed a direct judicial override to bypass the current probate injunction. I made it sound complicated, bureaucratic, and entirely out of my hands. Caleb leaned forward, the sweat returning to his forehead. He demanded to know how we fix it. I told them the only way Caleb gets paid before his dangerous creditors catch up to him is if we all walk into the county courthouse tomorrow morning as a unified, fully reconciled family. I said we needed to stand in the judge's private chambers together, present this newly signed mediation agreement, and officially request the immediate release of the funds. I told them the judge needed to see Chloe and me shaking hands and declaring the family dispute permanently settled. Chloe's eyes widened with pure blinding greed. She did not question the logistics. She only heard the promise of a massive payout. Caleb did not even hesitate. The absolute desperation radiating from him was palpable. He slapped the table and eagerly agreed, telling me he would call his lawyer right now and force him to arrange the emergency chamber meeting for 9 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning. They were so blinded by their own greed and impending financial salvation that they willingly agreed to march themselves directly into a federal building. My mother, Yvonne, stood up from her chair, walking over to me with a suffocating, deeply toxic smile. She placed her hands on my shoulders and gave them a firm maternal squeeze. She actually had the audacity to praise me. She lowered her voice and said that I was finally acting like a true sister. She told me that God heavily rewards those who protect the bloodline, and that Jamal would be so incredibly proud of me for taking financial care of his supposed son. The absolute sickness of her twisting my dead husband's memory to justify her golden child's extortion almost made me break character. Calvin nodded approvingly from the head of the table. He crossed his arms over his chest and added that black wealth is meant to be shared with the community, not hoarded by selfish individuals who have no legacy of their own. He lectured me on the importance of family unity, entirely ignoring the fact that he was actively participating in a felony. This was his standard operating procedure. Calvin always used the concept of community uplift as a convenient excuse to drain my bank accounts. 5 years ago, he demanded I pay off his luxury car lease under the exact same guise of maintaining his respected status as a church deacon. He viewed my corporate success solely as a communal funding source for his own ego. I did not argue with them. I nodded submissively, keeping my eyes cast downward in mock defeat. I grabbed my designer briefcase, stood up from the table, and walked out of the dining room. I did not say goodbye. I pushed open the heavy front door and stepped out onto the porch, leaving the suffocating smell of smoked brisket, fake piety, and absolute betrayal behind me. The humid afternoon air hit my face, but I felt nothing but ice-cold, razor-sharp adrenaline. I walked down the pristine driveway, my stilettos clicking rhythmically against the concrete, and climbed into the driver's seat of my luxury sport utility vehicle. I closed the door, engaged the automatic locks, and let out a long, steady breath. The performance was over. I reached beneath the silk collar of my emerald green blouse and carefully peeled the high-definition audio recording device off my skin. I plugged the discreet black device directly into my encrypted laptop resting on the passenger seat. I quickly scrubbed through the audio file, finding the exact timestamp of Caleb's voice ringing loud and clear. My guy made sure the notary stamp looks perfect. The audio quality was absolutely flawless. I extracted the specific audio clip, attached it to a highly secure email, and addressed it to Mr. Davenport. I typed a single concise sentence in the body of the message. The final piece of the puzzle is locked in. I will see you at the courthouse at 9. I hit send, watching the confirmation banner flash across my screen. I put the car in drive and pulled away from my parents' house for the very last time. Chloe and Caleb thought they were walking into the judge's chambers tomorrow to collect a massive payday. They had no idea they were walking directly into a slaughterhouse. The morning air was razor-sharp and unforgiving as I pulled my luxury sport utility vehicle into the underground parking garage of the county courthouse. I turned off the engine and sat in the profound silence of the cabin for exactly 60 seconds. Today was not a day for grief. Today was not a day for tears, or mourning the husband who had been stolen from me far too soon. Today was a day for absolute surgical execution. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I had stripped away every ounce of the defeated, exhausted widow persona. I had spoon-fed them at the cookout yesterday afternoon. I was wearing a meticulously tailored bone-white designer suit that cut a striking authoritative silhouette. I paired it with obsidian black stilettos and a simple, elegant gold watch Jamal had given me for our 5th anniversary. I looked like a woman who owned the building, a woman who commanded respect the second she walked into a room. I grabbed my designer briefcase, the one currently holding the authenticated medical records, proving Jamal's permanent sterility, and stepped out into the damp morning air. I rode the elevator up to the main floor, the heavy metallic doors sliding open to reveal the sprawling marble-floored expanse of the courthouse lobby. The space was an echo chamber of anxious plaintiffs, bored clerks, and fast-talking attorneys. I found a quiet spot near the towering granite columns directly outside the probate judicial chambers and simply waited. I did not check my phone. I did not pace. I stood perfectly still, projecting a wall of impenetrable ice. 10 minutes later, the heavy revolving glass doors at the front of the lobby spun violently. The noise of their arrival preceded them by a mile. Chloe strutted into the federal building like she was walking a red carpet at a reality television premiere. The absolute sheer audacity of her outfit made my stomach churn with a mixture of disgust and dark amusement. She was wearing a blindingly bright canary yellow designer dress that was entirely inappropriate for a legal setting, paired with a massive logo, heavy luxury tote bag. It was painfully obvious that she had gone on a massive, frantic shopping spree late last night, swiping a high-interest credit card because she fully believed a $200,000 wire transfer was just minutes away. She was holding baby Lucas awkwardly against her hip, bouncing him aggressively. She was not holding him like a mother seeking comfort. She was holding him like a highly lucrative prop, positioning him outward so every passing clerk and security guard could see the innocent fatherless child she was supposedly fighting for. Right beside her walked Caleb, and the contrast between the two of them was genuinely jarring. While Chloe was practically floating on a cloud of toxic delusion, Caleb looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. His face was pale and slick with a greasy sheen of nervous sweat. He was wearing an ill-fitting gray suit that strained across his shoulders, and his eyes darted frantically around the busy lobby. Every time a courthouse security guard walked past, Caleb flinched. He was twitching his hands, plunging into his pockets and pulling them back out. A physical manifestation of a man who knew violent loan sharks were actively hunting him down. He managed to force a stiff, unnatural grin onto his face, attempting to project the swagger of a victorious man, but the sheer terror vibrating off his body was impossible to hide. Flanking them on either side, marching into the courthouse, like proud royalty overseeing their dominion, were my parents. Yvonne and Calvin wore their absolute best Sunday church attire. Calvin held his chin high, his chest puffed out, nodding to passing strangers with a completely unearned sense of civic pride. He looked exactly as he did when he stood at the church pulpit, dripping with arrogant authority. Yvonne carried a large quilted designer purse, her face arranged in an expression of pious sacrificial grace. They walked in lockstep with the grifter and the golden child, completely unified in their mission to strip me of everything I had built with my dead husband. They spotted me standing by the granite column. The unified front marched directly toward me, their footsteps echoing loudly across the marble floor. Yvonne broke away from the pack and stepped into my personal space, her heavy floral perfume invading the air between us. She smiled a sickeningly sweet, deeply manipulative smile and reached out to smooth a non-existent wrinkle on the lapel of my white suit. She lowered her voice, adopting that fake maternal tone she always used when she wanted to publicly portray herself as the peacemaker. She told me she was so incredibly proud of me for finally seeing reason. She whispered that Jamal would be smiling down from heaven, knowing I had surrendered my pride to secure the bloodline and keep the family wealth unified. She actually had the nerve to say that handing over the cash today was the most mature Christian decision I had ever made in my life. conveniently forgetting that I was the one who quietly bailed them out of bankruptcy 3 years ago without demanding a single parade in my honor. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had watched me bury my husband and immediately conspired to steal my home, and I gave her nothing. I did not speak a single syllable. I simply stared back at her with eyes so entirely devoid of emotion that her fake maternal smile began to falter. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Yvonne nervously withdrew her hand from my lapel, taking a tiny, uncertain step backward. Caleb tried to fill the uncomfortable void. He stepped forward, attempting to puff out his chest to mask his visible shaking. He pulled out his cell phone, aggressively tapping the screen, and demanded to know where my lawyer was. He sneered, his voice cracking slightly, telling me that his guy had the paperwork fully prepped and they needed to get the judge to sign the asset release order immediately. He practically begged me to confirm that the wire transfer was queued up and ready to hit his account the exact second the probate freeze was lifted. He muttered that he had pressing business investments that required capital by noon, a pathetic, transparent lie to cover up the fact that a violent syndicate was likely waiting outside the building to break his legs. I slowly shifted my gaze from Yvonne to Caleb. I looked at the fresh, dark purple bruise blooming along his jawline, the physical receipt of his encounter in the parking garage last night. I looked at the sweat gathering at his temples. I still did not speak. I treated him exactly like a ghost, a pathetic apparition that I could not even be bothered to acknowledge. The psychological dominance of my absolute silence began to crack their unified front. Chloe shifted baby Lucas to her other hip, her bright yellow dress suddenly looking ridiculous in the sterile, serious environment of the courthouse hallway. She snapped at Caleb to calm down, assuring him that everything was going to be fine, and that they just needed to wait for the bailiff to call them into chambers. We stood in that tense, agonizing quiet for another 5 minutes. The contrasting energy was striking. They were a frantic, greedy, anxious mess of rapid breathing and nervous pacing. I was a monument of still, predatory patience. I watched Caleb pull his phone out of his pocket for the 4th time in 2 minutes. The screen lit up with an incoming call from an unsaved number. The color completely drained from his already pale face. He aggressively silenced the call, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the device onto the marble floor. The invisible noose was tightening around his neck with every passing second. Then the heavy brass and glass double doors at the far end of the courthouse lobby swung open with a resounding thud. The low hum of background chatter in the hallway seemed to part like the Red Sea. I looked up and watched Mr. Davenport stride through the entrance. The seasoned estate attorney wore an immaculate dark charcoal suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase that I knew contained the audio file of Caleb confessing to forgery, alongside the authenticated medical records proving Jamal's permanent sterility. But Davenport was not walking alone. To his immediate right walked Silas. My ruthless private investigator had abandoned his usual casual diner attire for a sharp, intimidating black suit. Silas carried a thick manila envelope tucked under his arm, the envelope containing the high-resolution photographs of Caleb making illicit cash drops to the disgraced former notary, and the pictures of Caleb being physically assaulted by known underground loan sharks. More importantly, flanking Davenport and Silas on either side were 2 massive, fully uniformed county court bailiffs. Their presence was not standard protocol for a simple voluntary mediation sign-off. They walked with heavy, purposeful strides, their hands resting naturally near their utility belts, their eyes scanning the hallway with absolute tactical precision. The entire dynamic in the lobby shifted instantly. Caleb stopped bouncing his knee, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror as he registered the approaching law enforcement officers. Chloe stopped bouncing the baby, her arrogant smirk sliding off her face as she noticed the grim, aggressive formation marching directly toward our group. Yvonne and Calvin instinctively took a step closer together, their pastoral confidence wavering as the heavy footsteps echoed against the granite walls. Davenport stopped a few feet away from our group. He did not introduce himself to my parents. He did not offer a polite morning greeting to Chloe or Caleb. He bypassed them entirely, acting as if they were nothing more than debris on the floor. He locked eyes with me across the tense space. His expression was a mask of cold professional finality. Mr. Davenport gave me a single sharp nod. The trap was officially sprung. It was time to execute. The heavy mahogany doors of the judicial chambers closed behind us with a solid echoing thud that sounded entirely like a vault locking into place. The physical atmosphere of the room was immediately suffocating, smelling of old paper, leather polish, and the sheer gravity of the law. Behind a massive elevated desk sat the presiding probate judge. He was a stern older man with iron gray hair and a deeply lined face that broadcast an absolute intolerance for courtroom games. He did not look up immediately. He was carefully reviewing the stack of paperwork placed before him, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. The spatial dynamics of the room perfectly mirrored the psychological battlefield. On the left side of the large conference table positioned in front of the judge's bench, my family assembled their unified toxic front. Chloe took the seat closest to the center, practically glowing in her blindingly bright yellow designer dress. She adjusted baby Lucas on her lap, sitting up perfectly straight, making sure the judge had a clear, unobstructed view of the innocent, fatherless child she was supposedly advocating for. Caleb took the chair right beside her, but he could not remain still. He was physically vibrating, shifting his weight from side to side, tapping his cheap dress shoes against the carpeted floor. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, desperately waiting for a parachute that he believed was just minutes away. The dark purple bruise on his jawline was poorly concealed by makeup, a glaring reminder of the violent loan sharks currently hunting him. Standing directly behind them, anchoring the fraudulent narrative with their oppressive presence, were my parents. Calvin stood with his chest puffed out, resting both hands confidently on the back of Chloe's chair. He was projecting his full pastoral authority, attempting to fill the legal chamber with the same unearned arrogance he brought to church board meetings. Yvonne stood perfectly poised beside him, clutching her quilted designer bag. She wore an expression of pious sacrificial grace, playing the role of the exhausted matriarch who had successfully guided her broken family toward a healing resolution. On their far left stood Chloe's attorney, a man whose cheap suit and overly enthusiastic demeanor screamed of late-night television commercials and predatory billing practices. He was practically salivating, shifting his briefcase from hand to hand, clearly anticipating a massive cut of the settlement money. I took the single chair on the right side of the table. I sat perfectly still, my posture impeccably straight in my tailored white suit. I did not look at them. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, projecting an aura of absolute impenetrable calm. Mr. Davenport stood directly behind my right shoulder, radiating the quiet, lethal authority of a seasoned corporate attorney. Flanking the heavy oak doors at the back of the chamber stood Silas, my private investigator, and two fully uniformed, heavily armed county court bailiffs. Their presence alone completely altered the oxygen in the room, but my family was too blinded by their own greed to notice the trap closing around them. The judge finally looked up from the paperwork, removing his glasses and placing them deliberately on his desk. He fixed a sharp, penetrating stare on Chloe's attorney. He noted that the court had received an emergency petition to bypass the current probate freeze based on a privately mediated settlement agreement. He stated that releasing such a significant amount of liquid assets on an expedited timeline was highly irregular and required absolute, unanimous consent from all involved parties on the official record. Chloe's attorney stepped forward immediately, his voice overly loud and dripping with sleazy confidence. He addressed the judge, claiming that this was a beautiful example of a family coming together to correct a tragic oversight. He pointed toward Chloe and baby Lucas, launching into a highly rehearsed, deeply manipulative speech. He stated that my late husband, Jamal, had carried the heavy burden of a secret child and had drafted a revised will to ensure his bloodline was properly secured. He claimed that I, the grieving widow, had finally accepted the moral and legal validity of this revised will, and that, transferring the $200,000 today, was the only way to bring peace to this fractured household. Yvonne could not resist the opportunity to insert herself into the official narrative. She stepped forward, placing a hand on her chest, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. She told the judge that our family had always prided itself on Black excellence, integrity, and community uplift. She claimed that this settlement was an act of profound Christian grace, a way to honor Jamal's memory, without dragging his personal failings through a messy public trial. Calvin nodded solemnly in agreement, adding that they simply wanted to protect the innocent child and put this unfortunate chapter behind them. The judge raised a single hand, instantly silencing their theatrical performance. He was not interested in their pastoral grandstanding or their fake piety. He turned his piercing gaze directly to me. The weight of his stare was immense. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together on the polished wood of his desk. He addressed me by name, asking me directly if I had reviewed the settlement contract presented by opposing counsel. He asked me for the official court record, if I conceded to the legal validity of the revised will, the paternity claim regarding the child, and the immediate transfer of $200,000 to my sister. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the frantic, rapid tapping of Caleb's foot against the floor. I could feel the collective predatory anticipation radiating from the left side of the table. They thought they had won. They thought the public pressure, the church gossip, the exhumation threats, and the sheer emotional exhaustion of burying my husband had completely broken my spirit. They thought I was going to quietly say yes, sign my name, and hand over the wealth I had built. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany table. I pushed my chair back slowly, the sound scraping loudly against the silence. I stood up to my full height, smoothing the crisp lines of my white suit. I looked the judge directly in the eyes, my voice steady, cold, and echoing with absolute authority. "No, Your Honor. I do not concede. In fact, I am here to report a coordinated felony." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Caleb physically jolted backward, his knee slamming into the underside of the table. Chloe gasped, clutching Lucas so tightly the baby let out a startled cry. Yvonne let out a sharp, breathless sound of shock, stepping back as if she had been physically struck. Calvin's face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson, his pastoral facade shattering into pure rage. Chloe's sleazy attorney immediately started waving his hands, sputtering and shouting objections, demanding that the judge disregard my statement as the emotional outburst of a volatile, unstable widow. He frantically tried to point at the fraudulent settlement contract resting on the judge's desk, claiming I had already signed it and the matter was legally binding. The judge slammed his wooden gavel down with a deafening crack, demanding absolute order in his chambers. The sharp sound paralyzed the room. Before Chloe's attorney could utter another word, Mr. Davenport bypassed the conference table entirely. He stepped directly into the open space in front of the judge's elevated bench, completely commanding the room with his presence. Davenport did not speak immediately. He reached into his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out 3 massive, meticulously organized legal binders. He raised them high enough for everyone in the room to see, then dropped them directly onto the center of the judge's polished desk. The heavy, resonating thud of those binders hitting the wood sounded like a coffin slamming shut. Davenport's voice cut through the stunned silence like a scalpel. He addressed the judge, stating that opposing counsel had knowingly submitted a fraudulent document to a federal court in an active attempt to extort hundreds of thousands of dollars from a grieving widow. He stated that the revised will was a complete fabrication. The paternity claim was a biological impossibility, and the entire legal maneuver was a desperate, highly illegal conspiracy to cover up massive underground gambling debts. Caleb sprang out of his chair, panic completely taking over his nervous system. He started shouting that Davenport was a liar, that I was crazy, and that they needed to leave the room right now. Silas, standing by the door, took a single menacing step forward, causing Caleb to freeze in his tracks. The 2 armed bailiffs unclipped the safety straps on their holsters, their hands resting firmly on their equipment. The subtle, terrifying sound of leather unsnapping forced Caleb to slowly, shakily sit back down. The judge ignored the chaos erupting on the left side of the room. His eyes were locked entirely on the 3 heavy binders resting on his desk. He asked Davenport what exactly he was looking at. Davenport reached forward and flipped open the heavy cover of the first binder. He pointed to the thick stack of documents secured inside each page, bearing the raised, embossed seal of a highly respected reproductive medical facility. He instructed the judge to review the surgical reports, the post-operative analyses, and the final physician sign-off contained within those pages. Davenport's voice echoed off the walls as he narrated exactly what the judge was reading. He stated for the official record that 5 years ago my late husband Jamal had suffered a catastrophic testicular torsion that required emergency life-saving surgery. Davenport looked directly at Chloe, whose face was rapidly losing every single ounce of color, and delivered the execution blow. He stated that the surgical procedure left Jamal completely irreversibly and 100% sterile. I explained that Jamal was biologically incapable of producing viable sperm, making it a certified scientific impossibility for him to have fathered any child, let alone the one sitting on Chloe's lap. The oxygen was instantly vacuumed out of the room. The judge's eyes widened behind his reading glasses as his finger traced the undeniable medical conclusions printed on the hospital letterhead. He read the irreversible sterility diagnosis twice to ensure he was not misunderstanding the terminology. His head snapped up, his gaze shooting like a laser beam directly past the legal table, locking onto Chloe with an expression of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. I turned my head very slowly and looked at my sister. The arrogant, victorious queen who had strutted into the courthouse lobby was gone. Chloe's skin had turned a sickening, translucent shade of gray. Her mouth was hanging open, but she could not draw enough air into her lungs to form a single word. Her hands were shaking so violently that she had to place baby Lucas down on the conference table just to keep from dropping him. The fake timeline she had so proudly fabricated at the cookout, the detailed lies about hotel rooms and secret affairs, all of it crashed down onto her head in a crushing wave of public destruction. Yvonne and Calvin stared at the open medical binder in sheer uncomprehending horror. Their golden child, the daughter they had praised for providing a legacy, the daughter they had weaponized against my own painful fertility struggles, had just been exposed as a pathological, calculating liar. The perfect, pristine suburban facade they had maintained for decades was instantly, violently ripped away, leaving nothing but the rotting, toxic truth of their greed exposed for everyone in the room to see. The heavy silence inside the judicial chambers was absolute and terrifying. The judge kept his gaze locked on Chloe with a level of pure, unadulterated fury that seemed to instantly lower the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Chloe sat completely paralyzed. The arrogant, victorious queen, who had strutted into the courthouse lobby, was entirely gone. Her skin had turned a sickening shade of translucent gray, and her mouth hung slightly open as she struggled to draw air into her tightening lungs. She had walked into a federal building expecting to walk out with a $400,000 check, and instead she had just been slapped with undeniable medical proof that she was a pathological liar. Mr. Davenport did not give her a single second to recover. He was a seasoned corporate attorney who understood exactly how to systematically dismantle an opponent while they were actively bleeding out. He reached into the inner pocket of his immaculate charcoal suit and produced a sleek, compact digital audio player. He set the device gently onto the polished surface of the conference table, letting the dull click of the metal against the wood echo through the quiet room. Davenport looked directly at the judge and stated in a calm, authoritative voice that under our state's one-party consent laws, I had legally and securely recorded a private mediation attempt orchestrated by the opposing party just 24 hours ago. He stated that the court needed to hear exactly how the fraudulent document in question had been procured. Davenport pressed a single button on the device. The pristine high-definition audio immediately filled the tense legal chamber. Every single person in the room could hear the ambient sounds of my parents' dining room. They could hear the clinking of my mother's fine floral china and the soft hum of the suburban neighborhood outside her windows. And then, ringing out with terrifying, inescapable clarity, came Caleb's arrogant, sneering voice. "Do not make this harder than it is, Maya. The will is ironclad. My guy made sure the notary stamp looks perfect." Caleb physically recoiled in his chair as his own recorded voice bounced off the mahogany walls of the judge's chambers. The frantic, nervous bouncing of his knee stopped instantly. His eyes went wide with pure, blinding horror. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped blindly onto a live landmine and heard the mechanical click of the trigger beneath his foot. He looked frantically at his wife, but Chloe was still staring blankly straight ahead, her mind completely shattered by the medical records proving Jamal's permanent sterility. Davenport was not finished. He turned slightly and gave a subtle nod to Silas. My private investigator stepped out from the shadows near the heavy oak doors, walking toward the judge's elevated bench with the silent, predatory grace of a man entirely comfortable destroying lives. Silas handed the thick manila envelope to Davenport, who then spread a series of 8 by 10 glossy photographs directly across the judge's desk. Davenport laid them out one by one, methodically building a visual timeline of a coordinated felony. He instructed the judge to review the high-resolution surveillance photographs. He pointed to the first set of images clearly showing Caleb sitting in a dark, late-night diner, sliding a thick envelope of cash across a sticky table to a man Davenport identified on the official record as a disgraced former county clerk. The very same clerk whose name appeared on the fraudulent blue notary stamp pressed into the bottom corner of Chloe's fake will. Davenport then tapped the second set of photographs. These images captured Caleb pinned violently against a brick wall in the city's warehouse district, being physically assaulted by two massive, heavily tattooed enforcers. Davenport looked the judge dead in the eye and stated that Caleb was currently drowning in a massive six-figure illicit gambling debt owed to a highly dangerous underground syndicate. He stated that the entire emergency probate injunction, the fabricated affair, and the falsified paternity claim were nothing more than a desperate, highly illegal conspiracy engineered to extort hundreds of thousands of dollars from a grieving widow to pay off violent loan sharks. The reaction from Chloe's sleazy bottom-feeding attorney was immediate and entirely pathetic. The moment the lawyer looked at the glossy photographs and heard the pristine audio recording of Caleb confessing to buying a fake notary stamp, his entire posture collapsed. He realized in a fraction of a second that he had just submitted a forged legal document to a federal judge. He realized he was standing in the epicenter of a massive, multi-count felony fraud conspiracy that was going to result in severe prison sentences. The cheap lawyer physically scrambled backward, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the carpet. He dropped his battered leather briefcase. It hit the floor with a loud, crashing clatter that made my mother Yvonne jump in her seat. The lawyer threw both of his hands high into the air, stepping away from Caleb and Chloe, as if they were suddenly highly radioactive. He started stammering frantically, his voice cracking with pure panic. He shouted to the judge that he had absolutely no prior knowledge of the forgery. He desperately claimed that he had been completely lied to and manipulated by his own clients, aggressively attempting to throw Chloe and Caleb under the bus to save his own law license from immediate and permanent disbarment. The judge did not offer the panicked lawyer a single ounce of sympathy. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying judicial disgust. He slammed his wooden gavel down onto the sounding block with a crack so deafening it felt like a gunshot inside the enclosed chamber. The judge declared with absolute, unwavering authority that the emergency probate injunction was officially and permanently invalidated with extreme prejudice. He stated that the document submitted by the opposing counsel was a crude, malicious fabrication designed to exploit the sacred mechanisms of the probate court. He looked at me, a brief flash of professional respect, crossing his stern features, and formally ordered the immediate unfreezing of every single one of my personal and business bank accounts. My wealth was officially returned to my absolute control. But the judge was just getting started. He shifted his piercing gaze back to the left side of the room. He stated that the court system was not a playground for indebted grifters looking to fund their illegal gambling habits. He stated that the attempt to steal a widow's home and desecrate a dead man's legacy was one of the most disgusting displays of human greed he had witnessed in his entire career on the bench. The judge raised his hand and signaled directly to the two heavily armed county court bailiffs standing by the entrance. "Lock the doors," he commanded. The sound of the heavy brass deadbolts clicking into place echoed with chilling finality. The room was officially sealed. There was absolutely no way out. The judge leaned over his bench and formally ordered the immediate detention of both Chloe and Caleb for suspicion of felony fraud conspiracy to commit extortion, forgery of a legal document, and blatant perjury before the court. The two bailiffs moved with terrifying coordinated speed. They crossed the room in massive strides, One bailiff grabbed Caleb by the shoulder of his cheap gray suit, yanking him violently out of his plush leather chair. The other bailiff moved directly toward Chloe. The physical reality of the consequences finally shattered Caleb's fragile, arrogant mind. As the bailiff twisted Caleb's arms behind his back and the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked aggressively onto his wrists, Caleb completely and totally broke. He did not act like a protective husband. He did not maintain the stoic silence of a man willing to go down for his family. He squealed like a coward. Caleb started screaming, his voice echoing shrilly off the mahogany walls. He violently twisted his body, fighting against the bailiff's grip, and pointed a shaking, restrained finger directly at his wife. He screamed that he was innocent. He shouted at the top of his lungs that the entire extortion scheme was Chloe's idea. He exposed every single one of their filthy secrets right there in the judge's chambers. He yelled that Chloe was the one who found the disgraced notary, that Chloe was the one who researched Jamal's signature, and that Chloe forced him to participate because she was completely obsessed with maintaining her wealthy suburban lifestyle. He screamed that the loan sharks were going to kill him, and she was the only one ruthless enough to use her dead brother-in-law to get the cash. Chloe let out a blood-curdling shriek as the second bailiff gently but firmly removed baby Lucas from her arms, handing the crying infant to a stunned court clerk who had rushed in from a side door. The bailiff then grabbed Chloe's wrists, pulling them behind her back. The pristine custom-designed yellow dress she had bought on credit specifically for this victorious occasion wrinkled and tore slightly as she was forced downward. The heavy steel cuffs locked around her wrists with a sharp, metallic snap. The golden child, the flawless, highly favored daughter, who could do no wrong in the eyes of my parents, was currently sobbing and thrashing against the grip of a county law enforcement officer. I sat perfectly still in my chair, watching the absolute destruction of my abusers unfold with an icy, clinical detachment. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the natural, devastating consequences of their own malicious greed consume them whole. But the true, unadulterated horror of the moment did not belong to Chloe or Caleb. It belonged entirely to my parents. Yvonne and Calvin were frozen in place behind the conference table, their bodies completely rigid with shock. The pristine, immaculate facade they had spent 30 years building inside the walls of Mount Zion Fellowship was instantly and permanently vaporized. Calvin's chest, which had been puffed out with pastoral arrogance just 10 minutes prior, had completely caved in. His shoulders were slumped, his mouth hung agape, and his hands trembled uselessly at his sides. I was watching his hand-picked, highly favored son-in-law scream like a cornered rat, exposing a massive, violent gambling addiction right in front of a federal judge. The illusion of black excellence and patriarchal control he had tried to weaponize against me was completely shattered. Yvonne looked like she was going to be physically sick. Her grip on her quilted designer handbag loosened, and the expensive purse dropped from her hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. She watched in sheer, unadulterated horror as the bailiffs forcefully marched her precious golden daughter toward the heavy oak doors. Chloe was weeping hysterically, her makeup smeared across her face, begging her mother to do something, begging her father to fix it. But there was absolutely nothing Yvonne or Calvin could do. Their church politics, their suburban gossip network, and their twisted family hierarchy held zero power inside the walls of the criminal justice system. The heavy mahogany doors were unlocked by a third officer stationed in the hallway. The bailiffs forcefully shoved Caleb and Chloe through the exit, dragging them out into the crowded courthouse lobby in full view of the public. The frantic, echoing sounds of Caleb blaming his wife and Chloe sobbing uncontrollably faded down the marble corridor as they were marched directly toward the county holding cells. The judge looked down at Yvonne and Calvin, his expression radiating absolute contempt. He ordered them to leave his chambers immediately. My parents slowly turned and shuffled toward the exit. Their heads bowed, their pristine Sunday church clothes suddenly looking like the cheap costumes of a failed theatrical production. They did not look back at me. They walked out of the room completely broken, stripped of their arrogance and their golden child in a single devastating morning. 1 week passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the judge's chambers slammed shut on my sister's fraudulent scheme. The fallout was swift, absolute, and entirely merciless. Caleb did not get his kneecaps broken by his underground loan sharks. Instead, the syndicate proved they were far more sophisticated than street thugs. They utilized ruthless collection attorneys who operated just on the edge of the law. The moment Caleb was booked into police custody, his creditors moved in and systematically stripped him bare. They seized his meager bank accounts, repossessed the luxury vehicle he leased to maintain his fake suburban image, and filed aggressive liens against every single asset he had ever claimed. Caleb was left with absolutely nothing, sitting in a holding cell, while the crushing reality of federal fraud charges loomed over his head. Chloe was faring even worse. The flawless golden child who had strutted into the federal courthouse wearing a bright yellow designer dress she bought on credit was now sitting in the cold, unforgiving reality of the county jail. Because her husband's assets were completely seized and her own bank accounts were thoroughly overdrawn from years of living beyond her means, she could not post bail. My sister was wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, eating terrible cafeteria food, and waiting for a criminal trial that would inevitably end in a felony conviction. She had tried to steal my home and desecrate my dead husband's legacy to fund her fake lifestyle, and now she was paying the ultimate devastating price. I was sitting at my sleek glass desk inside my public relations firm, finalizing the details of my massive new contract with Apex Dynamics, when my intercom buzzed. My executive assistant informed me that my parents were down in the lobby. She said they were frantic, crying and begging to speak with me. A week ago, I might have felt a brief flash of anxiety. Today, I simply adjusted the cuffs of my tailored blazer, leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, and told my assistant to send them up. The heavy glass doors of my executive suite swung open, and Yvonne and Calvin stepped inside. The transformation in their physical appearance was genuinely jarring. The arrogant, righteous posture they had weaponized against me at the church sanctuary was completely gone. Calvin looked like he had aged a decade in 7 days. His shoulders were slumped, his pastoral confidence shattered, and he could barely meet my eyes. Yvonne looked utterly defeated. Her usual immaculate hair was unkempt, and she clutched a crumpled tissue in her trembling hands. They did not look like the proud, untouchable pillars of Mount Zion Fellowship anymore. They looked exactly like what they were, two desperate people who had just realized they backed the wrong daughter. Yvonne stepped forward, tears streaming down her face, and placed her hands flat on my glass desk. She bypassed any attempt at a genuine apology for orchestrating the smear campaign against me. She went straight to the pleading. She begged me to help my sister. She cried that Chloe was terrified inside the county jail, that she was crying every night, and that the public defender assigned to her case was completely incompetent. Yvonne begged me to use my crisis management funds to hire a high-powered criminal defense attorney to save Chloe from a lengthy prison sentence. Calvin found his voice stepping up beside my mother. He tried to use his old manipulative tactics, softening his tone to sound like a forgiving patriarch. He told me that family must stick together during times of catastrophic hardship. He said that I had already proven my point, that the judge had given me my money back, and that I needed to show Christian mercy to my flesh and blood. He actually had the sheer audacity to ask me to write a check to save the woman who had publicly claimed she was sleeping with my deceased husband. I sat perfectly still, letting their desperate pleas echo against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. I looked at the two people who had spent my entire life minimizing my achievements, weaponizing my fertility struggles, and demanding I finance their golden child's mistakes. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I looked directly into my mother's tear-filled eyes, leaning forward just slightly to ensure she heard every single syllable of my response. "You told me God was humbling me," I said, my voice dripping with absolute ice-cold finality. "It looks like he missed and hit Chloe instead." Yvonne gasped, taking a stumbling step backward, as if I had physically struck her. Calvin opened his mouth to argue, but I raised my hand and silenced him instantly. I told them the mediation was over. I told them the negotiation was permanently closed. I stood up from my desk and systematically dismantled the illusion of their financial independence. I informed them that effective immediately, I was officially severing all ties. I looked Calvin dead in the eye and told him I had just canceled the automatic monthly transfers that paid for his premium health insurance policy. I looked at Yvonne and told her I had permanently revoked my guarantor status on the line of credit they used to maintain their pristine suburban lifestyle. I laid out every single financial safety net I had silently provided them over the past 5 years. The quiet bailouts, the property tax coverages, the emergency funds they took for granted while publicly criticizing my career. I told them I was cutting off every single cent. If they wanted a high-powered criminal defense attorney for their precious golden child, they could mortgage their own home and pay for it themselves. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the button for building security. I told Yvonne and Calvin they had exactly 60 seconds to exit my corporate suite before armed guards escorted them out of the building. My parents stared at me in sheer, unadulterated horror. They finally realized that the obedient, desperate daughter, who constantly craved their approval, was dead and gone. In her place stood a woman who refused to be emotionally or financially extorted ever again. They turned and walked out of my office, their heads bowed in total defeat, carrying the crushing weight of their own destructive choices. With the toxic weight of my biological family completely severed from my life, I initiated the final phase of my rebirth. I knew I could not stay in the custom-built house in the suburbs. As beautiful as it was, the property held too many lingering ghosts. It was tainted by the memory of Caleb spitting on my welcome mat and the suffocating echo of the neighborhood gossip mill. I contacted a premium real estate broker and listed the property the very next morning. Because of the explosive local news coverage surrounding the thwarted fraud case and the pristine high-end custom finishes, Jamal and I had meticulously selected, the house did not just sit on the market. It triggered an aggressive, highly competitive bidding war among wealthy corporate executives relocating to the city. I sold our $800,000 custom home for over $1.2 million in a pure contingency-free cash transaction. I took that massive influx of capital, combined with the surging profits from my newly secured crisis management retainers, and I elevated my entire existence. I left the suffocating, judgmental suburbs behind entirely. I purchased a stunning, sprawling luxury penthouse located in the very heart of the Atlanta skyline. The new space was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls, imported marble floors, and an expansive private terrace that hovered above the bustling city streets. It was a space completely untouched by my family's toxicity, free from the prying eyes of church elders, and unburdened by the heavy sorrow of Jamal's sudden passing. It was a blank canvas, a pristine sanctuary built solely on my own terms. Months passed, and the painful chaos of the courtroom execution faded into a distant, satisfying memory. Chloe eventually took a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial, accepting a substantial sentence in a state facility, while Caleb was shipped off to federal prison for his coordinated financial crimes. Baby Lucas was placed with Caleb's distant relatives in another state, safely removed from the chaotic, fraudulent environment his parents had created. My parents faded into absolute obscurity, forced to downsize their lives and endure the brutal, unforgiving judgment of the very church community they had once weaponized against me. I stepped out onto the expansive balcony of my new penthouse, the cool evening breeze sweeping across the Atlanta skyline. The city stretched out before me, an ocean of glittering lights and endless possibilities. I held a crystal glass of incredibly expensive vintage wine, savoring the rich, complex flavor as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting vibrant streaks of purple and gold across the clouds. My public relations firm was thriving beyond my wildest projections, attracting elite, high-profile corporate clients who respected my ruthless strategic vision. My financial assets were locked down, aggressively compounding in secure, untouchable investment portfolios. I had fiercely protected my late husband's legacy, ensuring that his impeccable name was entirely cleared of the disgusting, fabricated lies my sister had tried to attach to it. I had decimated my abusers publicly, legally, and financially without ever stooping to their level of chaotic desperation. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute, uninterrupted peace of the moment wash over my spirit. I had survived the sudden, catastrophic loss of my life partner. I had survived a highly coordinated, malicious betrayal by the very people who shared my bloodline. But as I looked out over the glowing city, I realized the most profound victory was not seeing Chloe in a jumpsuit or watching my parents lose their social standing. The ultimate revenge was the quiet, unshakable realization that I had never actually needed them to begin with. I did not need their validation to be successful. I did not need their approval to be whole. I had walked through the absolute darkest valley of my life and emerged as a woman who was entirely self-sufficient, wildly successful, and completely free. I took a final sip of my wine, smiled into the twilight, and turned back inside my beautiful, quiet home, ready to conquer whatever tomorrow would bring. The ultimate lesson from this journey is that your absolute worth is never defined by those who are committed to misunderstanding you. Toxic family dynamics thrive on silence and submission, but true power lies in financial independence and strategic boundaries. When blood relatives choose greed over loyalty, walking away is not a defeat. It is the ultimate victory. You do not need to accept abuse disguised as tradition or obligation. Building your own success in the shadows allows you to emerge untouchable. Sometimes the most profound justice is simply thriving on your own terms and leaving your abusers entirely behind. If you have ever had to build your own table because your family refused you a seat, hit the like button and subscribe to share your story in the comments below.